to host today's first panel on the battle for Israel in the public sphere. I have with me today Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and a veteran journalist himself. Welcome. And I also have attorney Talia Sasson, former head of the Special Task Division of the State's Attorney's Office and the immediate past board president of New Israel Fund. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. Welcome to both of you. So, I want to start out with a question that I'd like each of you to address, which is really how much should we care about what the world thinks about us? Why have this panel? Dan, why don't you start?
Thanks, Maayan. Back in 1955, March 29th to be specific, 1955, David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister, said shmum, the famous expression, which means the UN, who cares? He continued to say, responding to accusations that he shouldn't invade Gaza following massive terror attacks against the Negev, it's more important, it's less important what the nations, or he called the Goyim, say than what the Jews do. Well, 63 years later, the world situation has completely changed. And if you watch NBC News these months, they're talking about the Nazi moment of Kanye West in the United States. Israel and the Jewish people are under unprecedented assault. Their very legitimacy, their very right to exist in secure and defensible borders, and therefore it's extremely important what is said about Israel, and even more important, what does Israel say about itself and about its adversaries. And just to finish up this point, we've seen very violent rhetoric in Israel over recent issues, whether it's judicial reform, whether it's the issue of apartheid and the Palestinian issue, which we hear in Israel. And if Israel delegitimizes itself, criminalizes itself by using language that its harshest enemies used against it, well, that unfortunately will inflame anti-Semitism abroad and will increase Israel's isolation in international organizations. So Israel should be careful about its rhetoric and be very vigilant about what its enemies are saying about it.
Do you agree?
Not exactly. But before that, I have a comment about what Danny Denon just said. He was so committed to remove outposts from the West Bank, although this outpost is relevant to a Palestinian one. But there is a long list of outposts on the table of the Prime Minister that were put on his table in 2005. I did it, and at the request of Prime Minister Sharon. And if he is so committed to the rule of law, then he has a long list of illegal outposts to remove from the West Bank.
So good thing is that we're going to have a panel on that later in the day, and I'm sure it will be addressed, but thank you for that. So address this question. What should we care about what the world thinks about us?
I think that since Israel depends on the world, especially on the United States and Europe, it should listen carefully to what is said about Israel there. And it's very, very important to Israel since we are depend on everything on the United States. We usually, many of us are regularly forget about that, but this is the truth. And those people that are sitting in the Prime Minister's office, they know that very well. And this is why it's so important for us to be aligned with the Western world, especially when we are talking about democracy in Israel. We have to maintain our democracy for us and for the vision of the state of Israel in the world and the international community.
So let me ask you this. This government, as it was getting elected, and certainly right after it was elected, there were a couple of names that showed up in all the headlines around the world. I'm sure you know who they are. They are now Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Having them in the government, how does that impact the way Israel is perceived abroad? Talia, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, last week there was a delegation of senators from the United States here in Israel, a bipartisan one. And they announced in advance that they're not going to meet nor Ben-Gvir or Smotrich. So this is the face of the government. Homophobian, fascist, Ben-Gvir was invicted in violence and terror declarations. This is not the way how the government of the State of Israel should be seen in the world and should be done in Israel.
Do you agree?
You know, Maayan, when we Israelis on international television, the Jerusalem Post Democracy 2023 conference, refer to ourselves in a democratically free and fair election as having fascist government ministers, I think we tread on very dangerous ground. You know, fascist is a term we all remember from probably the greatest act of mass murder in human history. Fascist is the word that Yasser Arafat used in his 1968 Palestinian National Charter. Fascist is the word that Ahmed Shkeri used in 1961 at the United Nations when he was the Saudi representative and then the founder of the PLO and the first establisher of the 1964 Palestinian Charter. Fascist is a word that Hezbollah, Iran, and our worst enemies use against us. So if we begin to adopt their nomenclature, it is no doubt why there are thousands and thousands of Israeli and Jewish students around the United States who are hiding under their desks and taking off any signs of being Jewish and understanding the worst spike in anti-Semitism since the Second World War. We have to be careful about self-delegitimization, political annihilation. This is simply extremely dangerous territory.
I see you want to respond. Go for it.
Yeah. Yes, well, we are to be blamed of telling the truth to the world. What should we do? Maybe the thing that we should have been done is not to appoint those people to the government. And we did it only because Mr. Netanyahu had no other else to make a coalition, because nobody wants to sit with him because he is in charge in the criminal court in Jerusalem. This is the reason.
Can you imagine for a moment if the Israeli government chose not to sit with democratic elected officials of any of its democratic allies, beginning with the United States, and there were senior officials that were very unpleasant and unpopular to many Israeli officials. A democratic election in a free and fair democratic society is the will of the people. And if we begin to play with that principle, boy, oh boy, are we moving into self-annihilation territory.
So, you know, it's obvious from hearing the two of you that there is a very big divide here in this country on many issues, including the elected government, but also other core issues, West Bank sovereignty, judicial reform, and all of the things that we're going to speak about today during this conference. Is there a right or wrong way then to talk about these divides? It sounds like the two of you think there is. And what could really be the actual impact of our internal debates on the way that Israel is viewed abroad? Dan, you start.
Most important, Maayan, the most important thing is, yes, self-criticism is very important. Talia wrote an important report back in 2005, appointed by Prime Minister Sharon. You did not get involved in invective. You spoke about policy. And it's very important for Israel to check what they called Bedek Bait, its own regulating what they called outposts at that time, unauthorized become authorized, not building on private land, et cetera, et cetera. Very important. The problem we face is that we deal in self-criticism as a democracy, but it very quickly bleeds into anti-Semitism. The line is very, very thin.
So are you saying that what we say about ourselves becomes the anti-Semitic rhetoric
No,
abroad?
when we talk about ourselves or when other people talk about us, they have to do so from the point of view of policy critique stripped away of hyperbole in historic context, in the context of our diplomatic rights, in the context of our legal rights, which there are. And unfortunately, as international attorney, former advisor to the Foreign Ministry, Alan Baker, has written extensively, that all too frequently transforms from clean criticism that weighs Israel's rights versus its responsibilities into these buzzwords like OPT, occupied Palestinian territory, imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. We hear this language all over the place. And Israel has not done a great job, to put it mildly, nor has the Jewish leadership in the United States to stand up against this type of annihilationist language. That is the major threat of the day. And by the way, its source is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has, as a matter of its strategy, advanced this type of annihilist nomenclature to drive a wedge between Israel and the diaspora. And one has to admit that Mahmoud Abbas, when he says 50 Holocausts, when he says that we infect Palestinians with corona, when Prime Minister Shtaya says that we play with Palestinian body parts and that we poison the wells, these are all millennia-old blood libels. And we have to be very clear about what we're facing in the international community and not to engage in this type of self-annihilation.
What could be the impact of our internal debates? Talia, maybe speak a little bit about the protest and how it goes from internal debate
This
to...
is what I wanted just to raise. Look, everything that you said, although I don't agree with it, but it belongs to the past. It's not anymore relevant. What is relevant now, those people, hundreds of thousands of people that are in the street shouting for their democracy, for their values.
You can't hide those protests.
You can't hide it. Whatever you say before, we used to criticize, we didn't have to use such a language, yes or no, admit or not admit with it. It doesn't matter anymore. People are talking in the streets. They are looking for their values, for basic values, for democracy. This is what we are talking about here.
You're right. You're right about. Let me just ask you this question.
And you can't hide it.
No, we're not hiding here. We're exposing ourselves to the world, you and I, and having a very civil discussion. Having a civil discussion of.
We're trying to. We're trying.
I know I'm succeeding in it. let me just say, just make this point, Tali. Many of those 100,000 people join the other 5 million Israelis in talking about the difficulties, problems, and obstacles of the current Supreme Court setup. The problem in Israel is that it's such a hyper-politicized society that we ran to critique the solution before we discussed what there is quite broad consensus on, which is that we have a major problem with the with a Supreme Court that has, in the minds of many, and including former Professor Ruth Gaveston and Justice Posner in the United States, had become a second sovereign elite in Israel. Now, without mentioning what the solution is, because there's legitimate criticism of this solution and that solution, I admit. But it's very important in Israel, and that people understand abroad, that we are facing a need for reform that is a matter of wide consensus in Israel. And I think that should be the point of reference for our discussion, not what this solution or that solution must be, but that people in protesting in Tel Aviv have also themselves said there's a problem with the way the Supreme Court is set up, is extremely activist, the way Israel talked about it before 1992. And that's the point of reference that we should be discussing.
I don't know any system in the world or in Israel that doesn't need some corrections. There's no such a thing. So always when you say the judiciary needs to have some corrections, I could agree to this. We didn't start to talk about what kind of corrections.
Right, so that's actually
but one basic thing is that what this government is doing is turning democracy of Israel into dictatorship. This is what's happening here.
So let me ask you that. I mean, there are many different policies on the table. Obviously, judicial reform of policy has already been rolled out. But are there specific policies or potential policies that are more dangerous than others? You know, specific issues that could impact us not only in terms of rhetoric, but in other ways, in the international criminal courts or otherwise. Would people think we're breaking with democracy, as you're saying? What policies are you most fearful of?
Wow. How long time do
How
you
much time do we have left?
us?
I know, right? Tell me the first two.
The first two is first for Israel's democracy. This is the most important thing for me that could allow myself, my family, my friends, the society of Israel to continue to live in such values that we were used to until today. But there is something else. And that about the two-state solution, about what's happening in the West Bank, what this government decided to do with a mix of Smotrich and Minister for Defense what Smotrich that is turning the first understanding of the state of Israel, that the whole thing in the West Bank is temporarily. It's not something forever. This is an occupied area, and the international rule agenda is applying there. This is what's happening. This is what the state of Israel declared in the High Court of Justice all the years. So they're turning it to something that would appear forever. They are trying to annex the West Bank practically, not by declaring it, but practically.
Through action, you mean?
Yeah. And Ben Gvir that has his own, I don't know how to call that, power, people that under his command, I don't know how to call it. What about the Minister of Defense, who is... yeah, but what about him? He is the one that has the power of all the soldiers in the West Bank. So what is Ben Gvir?
So do you have similar fears?
I'll tell you what I fear, Maayan, and this conversation reflects exactly the difference in perspectives between being a conversation about Israel by Israelis, only about Israel. In other words, Israel is the point of departure, versus zooming out and understanding that we have to give moral agency to our neighbors, the Palestinian Authority. And this is very important. The Palestinian Authority, at 30 years of Oslo, has advanced a policy of what I call rhetorical annihilationism, pay to slay. They pay as a line item in their international budget, incentive money, annuities to kill Jewish civilians and Israeli civilians, not only Jews. They applied to the ICC without any authorization. They're not a state actor. They have mobilized these courts, weaponized these courts against Israel. And it's very important to understand that in 2023, it is time for Israel and its friends abroad to hold the Palestinian Authority accountable. Now, that's not to deny points that Talia made. It's not to deny at all, but it is to enlarge the strategic aperture of the conversation, because for 30 years, Israeli governments and many abroad have given the Palestinian Authority a pass. And it is time that they be held to the same standard as other actors, certainly as Israel is, and that has not been the case. It cannot be that Israel is being told that when it holds 138 million shekels and of monies to the Palestinian Authority, that actively engages in some of the worst terror financing in modern history and gives it to the terror victims, that then Israel becomes guilty somehow of not advancing the peace process.
So
something has gone wrong in Houston.
What about trying to solve the conflict?
So I'm going to stop.
Think about that.
I'm going to stop you. We have only a minute and a half left.
Oy.
So in order to wrap up, the topic of this was actually the battle for Israel in the public sphere. Talia, final sentiments. How do you respond? So how do we fight the battle for Israel in the public sphere?
All right. So people like myself, and there are many of us, we will continue to fight for democracy. We won't rest, and we won't get anything else but democracy and our basic values that we are believing in.
And you, Dan?
I agree with Talia. We are. I've been here for 33 years.
Come to the demonstrations, please.
1 second. I'm demonstrating at this round table. But
and we're ending on agreement.
We're ending on agreement in the sense Israel is a vibrant democracy. The question at hand now on judicial reform is what the balance of the democracy is, not if there's going to be or not going to be democracy. And at the end of the day, it is, as a proud Israeli, it is very important to speak loudly and confidently about our rights and our responsibilities as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, and also hold our adversaries to account when and when we're called upon to do that. And definitely, and I agree with Talia on this point, stand up for freedom, stand up for democracy. And I'm proud to say, from my standpoint, that Israel has done under these circumstances, which is not easy. Israel has not known a day of peace since the day it was reestablished in 1948. It's done a very good job. It continues to do a job, and the fight will go on. And if everyone has civil discussions as we've had, I think we'll be in very good shape going forward.
We'll hold another conference tomorrow. Well, thank you both, Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and Talia Sasson, who is the immediate past board president of New Israel Fund. Thanks so much.